Welcome to Margin of Thought, where we make space for the questions that matter. I'm your host, Priten, and together we'll explore questions that help us preserve what matters while navigating what's coming. Today I'm joined by Cody Venzke, a senior staff attorney with the ACLU's Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. Cody works at the intersection of the First Amendment, privacy, technology, and student rights. We get to talk about FERPA, COPA, AI tools in schools, student surveillance, social media regulation, and what parents and teachers should know before trusting a platform with student data. More specifically, we get a chance to talk about who is actually protecting student privacy right now when the law has not caught up to the technology. Let's get going.
Great to be here with you today. I'm Cody Venzke. I am a senior staff attorney with the American Civil Liberties Union. I work on our Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, which focuses on the intersection of the First Amendment, technology, and privacy, both under the Fourth Amendment as well as statutory authority.
Awesome. We have a lot to talk about today, so I'm very excited to have you on the show. I'd love to start with a conversation, I think, for both educators and parents. I think legislation, when they think about privacy for their students, is COPA and FERPA. But for folks who aren't super familiar with, the basics of those, do you mind doing a quick introduction and maybe tell us the lay of the land in terms of how they fit in these days?
Yeah, happy to. So COPA and FERPA are longstanding laws. The younger of the two is COPA, which is now coming up on its 26th birthday. And FERPA is now well over 50 years old. So it's safe to say they were written in slightly different periods than what we live in now. But you can think of them roughly as dividing the world in two halves. One is sort of the big tech online platforms that we might encounter outside of school. And then FERPA is the coverage for data used inside of schools. And they both do significant work to protect people's privacy, but because they are laws that are slightly older and written for slightly different times, they also have challenges applying and keeping up with today's rules. For example, FERPA, which was passed in 1974, was very clearly written with filing cabinets that have student records in the central office in mind. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't provide protections. And it's important that parents and children understand both the protections and rights that these laws provide so they can take advantage of what is already on the books.
It is amazing how laws that were not written for this time period are some of the ones that we rely on the most right now in the space. Do you mind give us an example of what kinds of protections FERPA provides in particular, what it was meant to protect, and then how it's been reimagined in the last 20 years, maybe?
Yeah, I'd love to. So FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, and it applies to any education records that are held by schools. So it doesn't apply to records that are held by other entities, but it critically applies to not just schools, but all of their contractors. So if they are working with a technology company to run a student information system, or with something like Zoom to do remote learning, all of that information is going to be protected by FERPA. And FERPA does two things. One is it provides parents and students with certain rights. And the other thing it does is it helps limit the disclosures that schools can make without parental consent. And on that first front, the rights that FERPA establishes, the key is access to student information. Parents are allowed to go and request to a school, I want to see my child's education record. And that's not just the permanent file that might be required by state law. It's all records maintained about a student by that school. And like I said before, that includes information that is maintained through electronic vendors. And so sometimes parents get the runaround from schools and companies saying, oh, we don't have that, go to the company. And the company says you have to go to the school. It is your right under FERPA to access those electronic files. I also said that in addition to the rights that FERPA provides to students about that right to access, it also limits disclosures. Now, FERPA has a lot of exceptions that are built into it, including disclosures to school service providers like Zoom or that back-end information system, or for research around improving pedagogical efforts, which I know that you might be interested in. Those exceptions, though, have conditions that have to be met. So, for example, if a school provides student data to a contractor like Zoom, like a Google Classroom, that information can't be repurposed for non-educational purposes. The vendor is required to adhere to the purpose that the school released it. So FERPA really does still serve, even though it's over 50 years old at this point, thinking about retirement maybe, is still serves to provide important protections for students and their families.
When we talk about the fact that the data can only be used for educational purposes, how broad has that been defined in follow-up litigation? I guess questions that come up often are like if a vendor is using data to train an algorithm to better serve their students, does that count as educational purpose versus like marketing Amazon products to them?
And first, you asked about follow-up litigation. It's one of the dirty secrets about FERPA is that there's been very little litigation. And part of that is because the Supreme Court decided in 2001 that FERPA didn't provide families and students the right to sue in court, that the only entity they got to enforce FERPA is the United States Department of Education. And infamously, in ed tech circles, FERPA has never actually been enforced by the Department of Education. It provides lots of coaching and guidance to schools on how to follow FERPA's rules, but it's never actually brought an enforcement action. Now, that's changing a little bit under the Trump administration, which is using FERPA for what I think we can safely call sort of unorthodox purposes. But right now, we've never seen an enforcement action brought against a school. That said, it doesn't mean that FERPA has not been the subject of a lot of interpretation and development. For example, these specific provisions that allow data sharing with education technology vendors were updated in 2011. And as far as FERPA rulemaking goes, that was quite the fracas where there were a lot of folks interested who weighed in through comments, a lot of debate about whether or not we were giving up too many privacy protections. But one of the big things that that provision did is it expanded an existing exception known as the school official exception. When you think school officials, you're probably thinking teachers, vice principals, things like that. And that's how that exception allowed sharing of information within the school system. In 2011, the US Department of Education expanded it, rightly or wrongly, to allow education technology vendors to also receive information if they met certain requirements. And one of those requirements, as you just suggested, is that they only use the data for legitimate educational purposes. Now, FERPA doesn't really define what is a legitimate educational purpose. It is up to the school when they contract with the vendor to make that clear. So that's one of the things that parents should be aware of when they are interacting with schools, when they're asking questions about technology, is how do you define school official? What information are you sharing and for what purposes? And then one of the key things is ensuring that schools have follow-up to make sure those vendors are limiting that use of education data. I will note one other thing is that this was widely recognized as a potential problem with FERPA, is that it sort of left schools to police what big tech companies were doing with student data. Many states chose to step in, passing laws known as SOPIPA, SOPIPA. And that provision made it very explicit. If you are in the K-12 space, you can't use information for marketing research. You can't use information to develop new products or for targeted advertising. So although FERPA is maybe the predominant education privacy law because it's the federal law in the books, it's not the only player, and states have an important role in protecting student privacy as well.
Wow, I feel like in the educational world, oftentimes this comes up with marketing language where you see like, oh, we're about compliant and we're go bright. Like that is used as a end all be all of a sign of data security and privacy rights for students and parents in particular. And it clearly, you've made it clear that that is not as broad as I think it's sometimes made out to be. When I think about this, I'm thinking like the difference between having to ask a parent permission before something is done with their student's data versus a parent being able to reach out and advocate for their student. How much of this ends up being in that second part? Because from what you're saying thus far, it does seem like most of the protections are like allowing parents to do something if they wish, more so than providing baseline protections for every student, regardless, or requiring schools to do a lot of outreach to parents. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is, I think, very accurate. And, one thing I will note is that FERPA's obligations fall on the schools. And there is no Department of Education authorized certification program for EdTech to go through that says, congratulations, you're FERPA compliant. And so you noted that that was a marketing slogan. And that is, I cannot emphasize that enough. FERPA compliance in glossy brochures or on EdTech websites is just there for marketing purposes. It is still schools' responsibility to make sure that their education technology vendors are actually adhering to the letter of the law. FERPA compliant on a website doesn't guarantee anything. So, as for the rights that FERPA awards, or rather maybe the proactive obligations it imposes on schools, there aren't a lot. Schools are required to put out certain policies, like who they identify as an education tech vendor, to give parents an opportunity to opt out of certain kinds of data sharing. But for the most part, it does envision a world where parents are taking a proactive measure to sit down and ask for access to student records. And to some extent, that makes a little sense. Where schools are big operations, we want them to be able to teach and engage in many of the other helpful things that they provide to their students without having to necessarily proactively provide those obligations. But just because FERPA doesn't necessarily require that proactive disclosure or outreach doesn't mean that they should not. And there's some really good baseline principles that schools should engage in, such as, for example, providing public information about what ed tech platforms they use, what data they collect, and what purposes that data collection is being used for. If they can, make those agreements with education technology platforms publicly available. Create fora for parents to come and ask questions about technology. I think one of the things that the pandemic made obvious for parents was just how much technology, how much data is being used, and they will have questions. And that has not changed since schools have gone back to in person over the past 3 or 4 years. So I think recognizing that parents are concerned about technology, they have questions about technology, and creating avenues and spaces for that is, I think, critically important, even if it's not strictly required by FERPA.
It's fascinating to hear how much of this requires good actors, right? Like who have the right information, but also are acting in good faith for all of this to kind of provide the protective measures that we hope they do. I'm curious to hear about a little bit about the litigation work you do. So, given that you're talking about how there's very little history of litigation based on FERPA, what is the litigation relying on? I know you mentioned the Fourth and First Amendment, but does that end up being a bulk of the cases that you all work on in terms of the privacy rights?
The First and Fourth Amendment are key to our work. Obviously, as the ACLU, we are constantly looking to the United States Constitution as the sort of beacon of civil rights and civil liberties that we seek to protect. Of course, that's not the only source of our rights, and Congress and state legislators pass legislation to help ensure that people are protected. I think FERPA could be fairly called one of those pieces of legislation, even if it doesn't allow individuals to sue on their own rights. And it is a place that we've worked on. Obviously, because FERPA doesn't allow individuals to sue, it's not a place where we've actively litigated. But for example, we provided guidance last year about education institutions' obligations under FERPA and how that intersected with some of the questions that were emerging under this administration, such as what are your obligations if ICE seeks information on undocumented students? What are your obligations as artificial intelligence continues to be an ever growing piece of our technological ecosystem? And so it is definitely a space where we think about and we look for ways to remind schools of their obligations, remind parents and students of their rights, even if it's not a statute that lets us litigate directly.
Can you walk us through some of those obligations, especially when it pertains to artificial intelligence?
Mhm. Well, I'm actually going to start with ICE because I'm starting with ICE for one particular reason. Because one of the many misconceptions about FERPA is sort of surrounded by this mythos of urban legend of what it requires and doesn't require and what it permits. And one of those myths is that it just generally lets schools share with other governmental agencies. And that's simply not true. FERPA has specific exceptions for sharing with specific entities, with, for example, the Department of Education, that require certain conditions to be met, such as a written agreement that requires the data to be deleted after a certain time. But there's no general exception that says schools may share information with any government agency that they choose. Applicable to ICE, it's applicable to your local law enforcement, it's applicable to your local health agency. Schools have to protect student information and follow the law, even if the entity asking for it is another governmental agency. So that's maybe the first thing that we highlighted in that guidance.
So the scenario I'm imagining is like the DOE requests the data and then they use it to inform ICE. Like what protections exist for something like that, right? Like is that is that an obligation of the DOE or of the school itself? This might be in the weeds, but I'm curious about what protections, how far these protections go.
Yeah, FERPA's obligations extend to educational institutions. They do not extend to the Department of Education. Now, for that data sharing with the Department of Education, FERPA is explicit. it requires a written agreement that includes purpose limitations. The Department of Education or its authorized representative can't repurpose the information and use it for other things, such as immigration enforcement. What you've asked about is truly a deeply structural issue. Could a school enforce that written agreement against the Department of Education? We don't know. Would there be other limitations, such as a lawsuit that could be brought under statutes like the Privacy Act, which coincidentally was passed in the same year as FERPA in 1974? So those are all really interesting questions, and ones, unfortunately, and I do mean unfortunately, that are coming to light more and more as we've seen the Trump administration through the Department of Governmental Agency, DOGE, through the Department of Homeland Security, break down longstanding norms and practices around federal data. And so if that ever came to pass, those statutes outside of FERPA might come into play.
I think one of the things that when you have an unorthodox presidency, reveals is how much of this is based just on precedent and norms, and how little sometimes we have explicitly put in protections for all kinds of spaces and not just the technology and education space.
Yeah. And I think you put it spot on when you're describing FERPA, where you said it was sort of written with the assumption that there would be good actors at schools. I think it's true of many of these privacy laws, where not only was it assumed that there would be good actors, that there would be adults in the room following those norms and precedents. And we are in an age where norms and precedent are being challenged.
I want to turn to COPA for a little bit because for parents, I think that is slightly more, I mean, it is slightly more relevant in terms of technology use outside of the classroom. Can you do the same thing we did with FERPA? Can you walk us through what protections COPA does provide? Obviously, that was written for the digital space. How much of that relies on good faith actors?
Yeah, COPA is the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. It was passed in 1999, so definitely written for online spaces. I think it was before many of the technologies that we've seen emerge since then, including the broad targeted advertising ecosystem, certainly before the emergence of artificial intelligence, before Web 2.0 and social media. And COPA has, I think, to put it generously, had to stretch a little bit to keep up with those pieces of changing technology. Roughly speaking, we will say COPA is sort of the FERPA equivalent that applies outside of the education space. It applies to private operators of websites that are directed to children. So there's really two critical things to note about FERPA. One is that it is not a general purpose privacy statute. It theoretically does not apply to the New York Times or ESPN or general audience websites. It applies to websites that are directed to children. So think Nickelodeon, Disney, things of that nature. The second thing is that when we say it protects children, we do mean that its application only applies to children under 13. And so when you're 12 years old, you are protected by FERPA. The day you turn 13, you are no longer protected by FERPA. And I will note, this is a reason that the ACLU champions comprehensive privacy legislation, because there's no reason there should be a distinct cutoff between we are protected from having our data abused to now we have entered the wild, wild west. But setting that aside right now, that's a project that's underway politically. The protections that FERPA provide are primarily focused on parental consent. If a child tries to use a child-directed website, that website is supposed to ask the child, hey, how do we get in contact with your parents? Through email, through a phone number, through any number of means that are identified in the statute. And then the parents have to provide consent to use the child's information, either to create an account, for personalization, yes, for targeted advertising. And then there are additional protections that are, similar to what we saw in FERPA, such as a right to review the information that the website has, a right to delete the information, as well as certain rules that the FTC has recently re-emphasized that limit the amount of information that platforms can collect, noting that it has to be somehow tied to the purpose for the collection.
What protections does COPA provide that are really necessary only for children? Like, is there anything that seemed like it was written that wouldn't apply to protections we would want for adults?
I would love to see many of COPA's protections extended to adults. In some ways, we're obviously not going to extend parental consent to 22-year-olds or something like that. But for the most part, the provisions that are there of we have to get your affirmative consent to use your information. You have a right to review and delete your information. We're going to have safeguards around the amount of information that's collected. And I want to dwell on that for a second. There's a concept we call data minimization. which is the idea that a platform can only collect, use, and share your personal information as it needs to provide the service you requested. So now what's buried in a privacy policy. But if you want to, for example, download and use Candy Crush, there should be no gathering of your geolocation secretly in the background because there's no reason for Candy Crush to be collecting that. If you download a weather app, yeah, they can use your geolocation to provide an exact forecast, but they're not going to turn around and sell it because there's no reason for that. And so that basic idea, which again, the FTC has been emphasizing as sort of a latent provision in FERPA, is one of the key things that we should see in privacy legislation that's extended for everyone.
That part of it's interesting, and then I think the 13 to 18 gap is the other part that I'd love to talk about a little bit because when a 14-year-old is, or I guess a 13-year-old, but a 14-year-old is, signing up for a website, legally, do we consider their agreement to the terms and conditions as legitimate the way it would be for an 18-year-old or older?
As far as COPPA is concerned, yes, they can provide consent under COPPA for data collection. COPPA is just completely silent on what are the rights of 13 to 18-year-olds. There's an overarching question that I am not situated to get into about minors' contractual rights. Traditionally, if you go to law school, they'll talk about the common law, which is basically the law we inherited from England when we broke away, which said that minors can enter into contracts. It makes sense. They can walk into a convenience store and buy bubble gum. That's a contract. But those contracts are voidable by parents. The parents can retroactively eliminate the contract as if it never existed. That might be a little bit more difficult to apply to online technology, but what you've touched on is a really hard question. And one of the difficulties that we see in this space is the fact that minors, as they age, continue to accrue independence. They accrue autonomy. Anyone who has interacted with children from the transition from being a 6-year-old to a 16-year-old knows that you can't apply the same regime, whether it's for privacy or content moderation or whatever, to those two individuals, or even that same individual at those two different points in time. And that is one of the things that has made legislation in this space so difficult, is how do we recognize and codify teenagers' increasing autonomy as they transition into that role as adults in a free society?
Um, so when we think about that increasing autonomy, there's the legal ambiguity of like how much legal autonomy does a 13 to 18-year-old have when it comes to, entering these contracts. But there's also the level of like how much of that autonomy ought parents and educators intrude on. And that's ends up I think that question has become more and more complicated as, the amount of different options open to young children to partake in things that I don't like, right? Like historically, when a child, a lot more was physically driven by location, right? So protecting a child, oftentimes knowing where they were, right? Like that did a lot. And so if they were at home or if they were at school, you knew somewhat of what the risks were of them being in that location. That's very different now when you have an electronic device and that gives you access to the entire world and the entirety of the internet. And so you can't say, oh, my child's in their bedroom, they're safe, right? Like that's not enough to rely on the way it was maybe like 30 years ago. What does that mean for how we think about the obligations of the companies themselves, right? There's a very fine line here between what parents can do and what these companies can do at the end of the day and what we want the government to do and to step in. And I know that this is a very complicated picture. So I'd love for you to just talk through like some of what you all are thinking about in this in that space.
So let's start with not the companies, but the government, because we are seeing lots and lots of legislation emerging at the state and federal level about how do we regulate children online. And for the ACLU, the first thing that we come is the free speech rights of both minors and adults. And one of the things that gets elided in these discussions is the free speech rights of minors. And the Supreme Court has been emphatic, with a couple of very key exceptions. The free speech rights under the First Amendment of a 6-year-old and a 16-year-old and a 26-year-old are coterminous. They are equal to one another. The exceptions being sexually explicit speech, which the Supreme Court just recently addressed in a case last summer, as well as I think in the school context. But beyond that, the Supreme Court, as I said, has been emphatic. And one example of that is in the early 2000s, there was pronounced concern about what are the negative impacts that video games are having on our youth, with lots of speculation. And I think I mean speculation that it was leading to aggression among teenagers, drug use among teenagers, and school violence among teenagers. I don't know if the research ever really supported those theories in a concrete, indisputable way, but that didn't stop states from attempting to legislate in that space. And California in particular banned the sale of violent video games to minors. And that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court struck it down, noting that there was no traditional exception for barring minors from accessing violent speech, and emphasizing again that the rights of children to access speech are in most instances on par with those of adults. So I think as we think about this space, as we think about regulation in this space, it's important that we start with that first principle about minors' constitutional rights.
So obviously, this is coming up most explicitly right now with social media regulations. And I do think some folks' intuitive responses are that this is a no-brainer, right? Like, of course, we should be protecting, 14-year-olds from being on Instagram, given all like the potential harms and how Meta wants to, right, like exploit it, whatever it might be. There are intuitive responses that I think are pretty strong. I think you all have a more complicated view on this. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how y'all are approaching the ability to ban minors from accessing social media platforms.
We will see as the litigation continues to pan out. My prediction, and maybe you can have me back on to if we ever see this right or wrong, is those efforts at flat bans will be struck down as unconstitutional for being an overbroad burden on minors' access to speech. And I think for the most part, a lot of legislators don't want to do that. They recognize that minors benefit from being able to speak. I think they recognize that society benefits from actually hearing from minors. I don't think anyone's very interested in going back to Victorian England, where minors to be seen and not heard, and are looking for alternatives. And we're watching those alternatives. And one of the big ones I would encourage entities to think about is data. And it seems so wonky that there is some really challenging speech available online, speech that is awful but lawful. It's constitutionally protected. But much of the engines of social media and other online platforms are driven by the fuel of data. And the government has more latitude, not unlimited, but more latitude in regulating how our information is used. And if they think through certain ways to be able to ensure that minors, with the consultation and support of their parents, sort of decide ways that their data is being used by social media platforms in constructing feeds, for example, or in targeted advertising or connecting them with strangers. All of those focuses on data collection and then its use are ones where the government has more latitude, and that's the space they should be exploring, as opposed to age verification and flat bans and trying to regulate the constitutionally protected speech off of the internet.
I think for like the layperson, helping understand the difference between accessing information and like being able to produce your own speech, are those equally protected for minors? I'm thinking their ability to post on Instagram versus regulating what they're exposed to on Instagram. Or does precedent treat that differently?
Precedent treats them as one and the same. And the answer is I think pretty intuitive for most folks. The right to speak means very little if others do not have a right to listen. I hate to cite 1984 because it's overwrought sometimes, but one of the delightful things, oh no, it's not 1984, it's Fahrenheit 451. It's often said that that is a book about banning of books. What's not illegal in Fahrenheit 451 is ownership of books. It's the reading of them that's been made illegal. And that's why that right to listen is so key, is because if others cannot receive what is being said, then the right to speak means very little. And that's right is equally protected. The right to listen is equally protected as the right to speak.
Super fascinating to think about how to still, there's real harms we want to protect children from, but not do it in a way that infringes on things that are fundamental to how we view our basic rights and our children's basic rights. I want to turn now to thinking about AI, both, maybe let's start more broadly.
We did say we would get back to AI. So
we did that. Yeah, I have that circled. I want to make sure that we get a chance to do so. And I'll start with the broad question of like, what are the challenges that AI is bringing that like other technology has not already brought, has not already kind of caused you all, or caused everybody to have to figure out how FERPA in particular, but also COPA applies in those spaces?
Yeah. One of the difficult things about artificial intelligence is that it is inherently a multifaceted technology. Up until 2023, and I know technologists are going to come after me for drawing a hard line right there, most technology you bought had a very specific purpose, whether it be a social media platform, which you buy with your data through targeted advertising, or Microsoft Word, or a assisted learning program that you might use in schools. And that made it easier to evaluate, is this a good fit for my family, for my classroom, etc.? What data does it need? What data is it processing? How's it being shared? But artificial intelligence is much more expansive. And so a large language model, which is, a chatbot, and that's only one example of a type of artificial intelligence, might be used as a search engine. And a recent poll from Pew shows that majority of teens are using chatbots primarily as glorified search engines. And frankly, I do the same thing. Or it might be homework help, or it might be an unlicensed counselor. And that fact that that piece of technology is functioning in so many distinct ways makes it sort of an interesting wrinkle to try to regulate, and not one that we've entirely wrapped our minds around at this point. The other thing that can make it very difficult to regulate artificial intelligence is the fact that they are probabilistic. We don't always know what outcome we're going to get from artificial intelligence, particularly large language models, based off particular inputs. We don't always know how we got from the input to the output. And that makes it extremely difficult to assess, is this being fair and equitable? Is it being discriminatory? Is it being reliable and trustworthy? Because we don't know necessarily what the internal processes of that piece of technology were.
The examples that I think we see the most are in relation to chatbots, both again, like inside the classroom and at home. But the kinds of technologies that use AI these days is much broader than that. Does non-generative, information generative technology have a different set of challenges? And I think some of the things that we said we might touch on are like, facial recognition technology. I mean, technology that detects police's speech by students, technology that tries to detect like weapons in a backpack, right?
And I think that's a point worth emphasizing is when we talk about artificial intelligence, it's a range of families, plural, of technologies. And of course, since the advent of public facing ChatGPT, we've primarily thought about AI as large language models, chatbots. But as you just underscored, it can be much, much broader than that, including, for example, technology that is computer vision, where they are using cameras, it might be existing surveillance cameras, attaching artificial intelligence to analyze feeds that come through there. That might be facial recognition technology to identify people entering or exiting a school. Is this a known student? Is this a teacher? Is it a stranger? As well as technologies that are trying to, for example, detect weapons. Does this student have a gun underneath a jacket, or detect aggression? And many of those technologies are untested, despite the fact that they might put students in contact with police when they are suspected based off a camera and a computer making a guess that they've brought a gun to school. They are nonetheless being sold without adequate vetting. And there are other technologies as well beyond computer vision. For example, we know that many schools are deploying technology to monitor students' communications using what sometimes could be just very basic algorithmic technology that has a list of words it's watching for, to more sophisticated large language models that scan chats, emails, documents, and things of that nature to look for signs of self-harm, bullying. And that sounds great, but they also make mistakes where students, for example, have been outed based on a Google Doc that was their diary, where they questioned their sexuality, and the large language model assumed that the use of the word gay must be bullying. And so we've seen these technologies being deployed across the school system, often with mixed results and often proving that they are untested.
Are there protections? Like, what do we have anything on the books that for like, here's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. Like, is there protection against a student being profiled by this information? Is there protection against false negative or false positive rates? Like, is there anything that is currently pre-existing that is being reapplied? And is there any pushes to add any of that?
It's very thin, unfortunately. And this is one of the situations where we see these existing laws really being stretched to the point where they may not be covering significant harms. There are very few laws, for example, that require significant testing of these technologies. That's one of the things that we've advocated for, is that if technology is deployed in a high impact scenario, like making decisions about whether or not a student advances to the next grade, or identifying whether or not a student is being too aggressive in the hallway and sending them to the principal for discipline, they need to be tested. But it's one of those places where we haven't seen significant extension of existing law to cover those particular scenarios. States here have an important role to step up. where we are seeing states really think about ways that they can assure that artificial intelligence that's being used in state and local government is tested, that it is vetted, that companies are attesting to the fact that the technology works the way it's supposed to, that it does not have discriminatory or unsafe impacts. And so, even though we have not seen the federal government, including Congress and the Department of Education, step up and talk about the ways that these technologies should be vetted and tested, states can play a significant role there as well.
I want to just think a little bit about, as we wrap up, about parents and teachers themselves. Some of the things that there's ambiguity around for educators, or that there's a lack of clarity and guidance on, is what they can safely do in terms of, like, I'll give you a couple of examples to make this more explicit. What safe uses that exist for them that are not either unsafe, period, or be in violation of existing statute. And so an example that comes up oftentimes is, like, there's lots of folks who talk about the ease of using some of these generative tools for making IEPs. There's a range of suggestions that I've seen from, like, don't include the student's name, like, make sure it's a paid account. Like, there's all these little caveats that are supposed to make this a safe practice. Is that true in terms of safety? And is that allowed under FERPA? Is there a certain way to do this that is FERPA compliant on a teacher's end?
It can be incredibly difficult to assess whether these particular types of technology are sharing, disclosing, and repurposing the information that you put into it. And one of the things that can be incredibly difficult is ensuring the fact that you aren't disclosing personal information. Yes, taking the student's name off the record that you were inputting into Gemini or ChatGPT is a smart first step, but it is not sufficient because, for example, if it includes additional information like the fact that this is the only Native American student in fifth grade, it doesn't matter that you remove the name because the school community knows who that particular student is. And there are many, many ways that removing the name and other identifiers alone can still allow the information to be traced back to an individual student. And so, what I think is really necessary here is for teachers not to be looking for ways that they on their own can find technologies that are safe, but advocate for themselves and for their students to the school board, to district administration, to state education leadership to establish the guardrails and the procurement processes. I know your listeners want to talk about governmental procurement deeply here, but and ensure that those entities, which are better resourced than your classroom teacher, are the ones who have a process in place for vetting this technology and ensuring that it's making appropriate use of student information. And again, this is one of the things that's unique about AI because when it was just a online graphing calculator, you didn't have to wonder if it was safe and effective. But now the vetting is not just about data and privacy, but it's does the AI do the thing that it purports to do safely and effectively?
That's very, very helpful. And parents, and I know that's a much broader question, but what can parents do, especially given that FERPA relies so heavily on proactive parents, to make sure that their students are protected at school?
Yeah. One of the things that parents can do is step up and fill FERPA's gaps while we wait for Congress to do so. And that means going to schools and asking questions about the technology. What technology is being used? What data is being collected? Can I review the contracts for that? How do you set up provisions for me to access my child's information that's being held by this education technology platform? What rights do I have, including the ability to correct student information that's been collected or held by that platform? What rights do I have to opt out and choose a non-artificial intelligence option? And so those are all things that require parents to engage in a conversation with teachers, with school leadership, and with district leadership. And I think in many ways it resembles what teachers can and should be doing, which is advocating for a thoughtful governance approach to the acquisition of AI, to the uses of student data.
When we think about parents trying to protect their children outside of the school setting, when they're thinking about their child's use of their iPhone at home, what are some things that parents should keep in mind in those spaces where there isn't an entity that they can call on to help provide some of those protective forces?
Even though the ACLU has been consistently skeptical about governmental regulation of minors' access to speech and ability to speak, it is fundamental that parents play an important role in coaching their children and navigating the complexities of living in a democratic free society. And that's especially true of online spaces. So I think two key things come to mind. One, of course, is talking to your child and your teenager about online spaces and ensuring that you are familiar with the spaces that they occupy. That's the applications that they use, the technology that they're using, and walk them through the potential dangers. When should you accept this friend request? When should you post this particular information? That they are aware that they are encountering individuals who may have unknown motivations, that personal information put out there can have particularly harmful effects, and also recognizing and coaching through how does the technology make you feel? What is your response to this post? What is your response to the amount of time you've been spending on the platform? So, in addition to those conversations, the second thing I would recommend is being aware of the options that are provided by these technologies. Many pieces of technology, whether it be hardware like your child's iPhone or social media platforms, provide tools for parents to be able to help their teenagers and children navigate these online spaces. Often they go unused. And that's one of the things I encourage legislators to think about is how can we legislate around setting toggles in a way that are more user and parent friendly. But parents should, when they have that conversation with a child that says, I'm on Snapchat, I'm on TikTok, and I love, Pokemon Go. What are the tools that those platforms are already providing for parents that they can use to help coach their child into being a well-grounded digital citizen?
Thank you so much. The amount of information you shared today, I think folks are going to find so much to sit with and grapple with. I have a list of things I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about. So I really do appreciate your time today.
Yeah, been a pleasure to be here.
Cody reminds us that student privacy cannot depend only on old laws, good intentions, or vendor promises. Schools, parents, teachers, and policymakers all have a role to play in asking harder questions about data, consent, surveillance, and student rights. This requires us to really sit down and ask, how do we prepare students for the future while protecting their freedom and privacy? For more on questions like this, order my book, Ethical EdTech, at ethicaledtech.org. Thanks for listening to Margin of Thought. If this episode gave you something to think about, subscribe, rate, and review us. Also, share it with someone who might be asking similar questions. You can find the show notes, transcripts, and my newsletter at preten.org. Until next time, keep making space for the questions that matter.